April 2017. The Light 11. This issue is dedicated to the memory of P.C. Keith Lambert, who died so that we may live. The Innocent made immortal on March 22, 2017. I shall love all mankind. And Leslie Rhodes. Keith Lambert. Aisha Fraid. Kurt Cochran. The Call of the Messiah. By Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad. The Promised Messiah and Mahdi. Different states of mind in 5 daily prayers. What are the 5 daily prayer services? They are pictures of your different states of mind during the course of the day. You experienced 5 conditions at a time of trial and your nature demands that you must pass through them. The first of these is when you are warned that you are about to be afflicted with a calamity. For instance, imagine that a warrant has been issued for your presence in court. This is the first condition which disturbs your serenity and contentment. This condition resembles the time when the sun begins to decline, as on the receipt of the court warrant. Corresponding to this condition, the noon prayer, Zuhr, has been prescribed, the time of which begins with the decline of the sun. You experience the second condition when you are drawn close to the place of the calamity. For instance, when having been taken into custody under the warrant you are presented before the magistrate. At that time, you are in terror and the light of security seems as if it is about to depart from you. This condition resembles the time when the light of the sun diminishes and the human eye can fix itself upon the sun and it becomes obvious that the time of its setting is near. Corresponding to this spiritual condition, the afternoon prayer, ASR, service has been prescribed. The third condition sets in when you lose all hope of deliverance from the calamity. For instance, when, after the recording of the prosecution evidence, which is designed to bring about your ruin, you are charged with an offense and a charge sheet is prepared. At this time, you almost lose your senses and you begin to think of yourself as a prisoner. That condition resembles the time when the sun sets and hope of daylight comes to an end. The sunset prayer service, Maghrib, is prescribed in relation to this spiritual condition. The fourth condition is when you are afflicted by the calamity and its deep darkness envelopes you completely. For instance, when, after the close of the evidence, you are convicted and sentenced and are committed to the custody of the police. This condition resembles the time of nightfall, when everything falls into deep darkness. The evening prayer service, Isha, is prescribed in conformity with this spiritual condition. When you have spent a certain time in the darkness of the affliction, divine mercy surges up and delivers you from the darkness, as the dawn succeeds the darkness of the night and daylight begins to appear. The dawn prayer service, Fajr, is prescribed corresponding to this spiritual condition. Allah, Most High, in view of your 5 changing states of mind, has prescribed 5 prayer services for you. You can thus understand that these services have been prescribed for the benefit of your soul. If you desire security against these calamities, you should not neglect the 5 daily services as they are a reflection of your inner and spiritual conditions. Prayer is a remedy for the calamities that may threaten. You know not what type of circumstances the new day may confront you with. So, before the beginning of the day, entreat your Divine Master earnestly that the day may prove to be a source of benefit and blessing for you. Kishti-na Noah's Ark, continued. Islamophobia, real or contrived? Real threat to world peace. Compiled by Ibrahim Mohammed, South Africa. Islam offers peace and justice, not fear. The very name Islam means peace. Muslims who do not live up to this lofty ideal, like the minority terror groups, do not represent Islam. Any unbiased seeker of truth will tell you that true governance, according to the rule book of Islam, the Holy Quran, is based on equality, justice, and high moral standards. Such was the example set by the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. The Holy Quran testifies to this fact. Certainly, you have in the Messenger of God, i.e. Muhammad, an excellent exemplar. 33:21. Many renowned academics, clerics, and statesmen from different faiths who studied the life of the Prophet Muhammad, may peace and the blessings of God be upon him, as an historical figure, have come to some fascinating conclusions. Here are some examples to reflect upon. George Bernard Shaw, well-known Irish dramatist and Nobel Prize recipient for literature, said, "I have studied him, Muhammad, the wonderful man. He was by far the most remarkable man that ever set foot on this earth. He preached a religion, founded a state, built a nation, laid down a moral code, initiated numerous social and political reforms, established a powerful and dynamic society to practice and represent his teachings, and completely revolutionized the worlds of human thought and behavior for all times to come. I have always held the religion of Muhammad in high estimation because of its wonderful vitality. It is the only religion which appears to me to possess that assimilating capacity to the changing phase of existence which can make itself appeal to every age. I have studied him, the wonderful man, and in my opinion, far from being an antichrist, he must be called a savior of humanity. I believe that if a man like him were to assume the dictatorship of the modern world, he would succeed in solving its problem in a way that would bring much needed peace and happiness. I have prophesied about the faith of Muhammad that it would be acceptable to the Europe of tomorrow as it is beginning to be acceptable to the Europe of today." The Reverend Bosworth Smith carefully studied the life of Prophet Muhammad, and in his book, Muhammad and Mohammedism, published in 1874, writes, "Head of the state as well as the church, he was Caesar and Pope in one, but, he was Pope without the Pope's pretensions, and Caesar without the legions of Caesar, without a standing army, without a bodyguard, without a police force, without a fixed revenue. If ever a man had the right to say that he ruled by a right divine, it was Muhammad, for he had all the powers without their supports. He cared not for the dressings of power. The simplicity of his private life was in keeping with his public life." Annie Besant, a prominent British women's rights activist, writer, and spokesperson for the National Secular Society, wrote in her book, The Life and Teachings of Muhammad, 1932, p.4. "It is impossible for anyone who studies the life and character of the great Prophet of Arabia, who knew how he taught and how he lived, to feel anything but reverence for that mighty Prophet, one of the great messengers of the Supreme. And although in what I put to you I shall say many things which may be familiar to many, yet I myself feel, whenever I reread them, a new way of admiration, a new sense of reverence for that mighty Arabian teacher." Mahatma Gandhi, the preeminent leader of the Indian independence movement in British-ruled India, and the person to whom modern-day nonviolence movements trace their roots, like that of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s civil rights movement, after studying the life of Prophet Muhammad wrote, "I became more than ever convinced that it was not the sword that won a place for Islam in those days in the scheme of life. It was the rigid simplicity, the utter self-effacement of the Prophet, the scrupulous regard for his pledges, his intense devotion to his friends and followers, his intrepidity, his fearlessness, his absolute trust in God and his own mission. These, and not the sword, carried everything before them and surmounted every trouble." Alfonso Lamartine, famous French historian, wrote in his Histoire de la Turque, 1854, Vol. 2. "If greatness of purpose, smallness of means and astounding results, are three criteria of human genius, who would dare to compare any great man in modern history with Muhammad?" Dr. Michael Hart, an American scientist by profession, more recently, studied important historical figures and ranked the top 100 most influential persons in history. He published his rankings in a book titled, The 100, and number 1 on his list was the Prophet Muhammad. He writes, Muhammad was the only man in history who was supremely successful on both the secular and religious level. It is this unparalleled combination of the secular and religious influence which I feel entitles Muhammad to be considered to be the most influential single figure in human history. Similarly, it was stated in the Encyclopaedia Britannica that the Prophet Muhammad was that most successful of all prophets and religious personalities. 11th edition, under Quran, first paragraph. Distinguishing characteristic of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, s. From an orphan to a king of a great empire, the Holy Prophet Muhammad passed through all phases of life so that he was able to provide a model for people in many different roles. If he had not been a laborer, he could not have revealed the value and integrity in working with one's own hands and earning an honest living. If he had not in his youth organized grassroots campaigns to serve the poor and protect the weaker members of society, he could not have been an inspiration for socially conscious community organizers. If he had not married, he would have left people unguided in practically half of their daily interactions, and could not have shown how to be a kind and affectionate spouse and a loving parent. If he had not been the head of an armed force, he could not have served as an example for a responsible general or an accountable commander-in-chief in the fight for justice. If he had not formed rules and regulations for his community, he could not have been regarded as an example for a conscientious legislator. If he had not been in the position to decide disputes among people, he could not have served as a model for an impartial judge or effective mediator. If he had not had lifelong friends, he could not have shown the beauty in true and trusted companionship. And if he had not been persecuted by tyrants, and then overcome his persecuting enemies, and forgiven them without enforcing any punishment against them, he could not have practically illustrated the lessons on compassion, mercy, and forgiveness that are contained in all revealed scriptures. According to the Holy Quran, Muhammad was raised as a mercy for all the worlds, not as a threat to peace to be feared by anyone. Finally, Thomas Carlyle, famous Scottish philosopher, writer, and historian, considered one of the most important social commentators of his time, who produced the famed work on heroes, hero worship, and the heroic in history, after studying the life of Prophet Muhammad, concedes. The lies, from Western critics, which well-meaning zeal has heaped round this man, Muhammad, are disgraceful to ourselves only. Emphasis is mine. We strongly condemn all acts of violence and the abuses of the rights of all humankind and the rest of God's creation. We especially condemn, at the top of our voices, the ruthless killings conducted in the name of religion or state. What is enlightenment? An Islamic perspective. M. A. Muqtadar Khan. University of Delaware. First printed in Journal of Religion and Society Vol. 16, produced by the Kripke Center. Abstract. This essay draws on Immanuel Kant's concept of enlightenment as an escape from self-imposed ignorance and argues that a similar concept of enlightenment can be understood within the Muslim context as escape from self-imposed jahiliyyah, jahiliyyah, Arabic term used for the period in Arabia before the advent of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, meaning days of ignorance, which is understood as fear to exercise reason publicly. The article advocates for ijtihad use of reason, is critical of taqlid blindly following the religious decrees of religious authorities, and invokes Islamic sources to invest confidence in contemporary use of reason for interpreting Islam. Return of Jahiliyyah. An enlightenment has come to you from your Lord, Quran 6:104. For nearly a millennium and a half, Muslims have understood Islam as a human condition that is antithetical to Jahiliyyah, ignorance. Most historical and religious accounts of Islam begin with a discussion of the state of ignorance in Arabia and often use it as a benchmark to underscore the civilizing influence of Islam on the barbaric Arabs of pre-Islamic Arabia. The great Islamic civilization that was produced with the explosion of knowledge in the fields of philosophy, science, sociology, medicine, and mathematics still remains a central influence on Islamic identity and an example of the indubitable truth of Islam and its transformative potential. In the same vein, the rationality of Islamic beliefs and Islamic socio-political order remains a major theme in the discourses of Islamic intellectuals, scholars, and preachers. The point I seek to make is simple: Muslims have always understood Islam as enlightenment, the path that rescued humanity from ignorance, irrationality, and superstitions and catapulted human society towards the apex of civilization, towards the realization of a perfect community based on divine principles. The present the Muslim community, can hardly be described as a perfect community or as one that is organized around divine principles. It clearly lacks enlightenment. This is not to deny the presence of many enlightened individuals and even movements, but the overall condition of the global Muslim community can hardly be described as worthy of emulation. Indeed, modern revivalist thinkers of Islam are conceptualizing the present age as an age of Jahiliyyah. Here ignorance is defined as the absence of Islam as the central fountain from which society derives its organizational principles. In order to understand the fundamental causes behind this state of decay, we need to understand what enlightenment is and how it relates to the vigor of societies. We need to learn to recognize the conditions that indicate the presence or absence of enlightenment in society and to elaborate, for popular consumption, why Islamization is enlightenment. Kant's conception of enlightenment. In order to elucidate the meaning of the term enlightenment, I wish to turn to a famous essay by Immanuel Kant, originally published in Berliniske Monatsschrift in December 1784, an answer to the question, what is enlightenment? In this essay, Kant, one of the great philosophers of European Enlightenment, defines enlightenment as man's emergence from a self-imposed immaturity. An enlightened man for Kant was one who had the courage to use his own understanding. In Islamic terms, this means one is competent to do one's own ijtihad, independent thinking. Kant was seeking to liberate human reason from the shackles of stagnant religious traditions that had deprived humanity of the freedom to use reason. He lamented the fact that, due to indolence and cowardice, a great proportion of humanity remained in a state of immaturity and subcontracted their thinking and faculties of judgment to others. For Kant, immaturity was the inability of an individual to rely on one's own understanding. Kant argued further that society could come out of such a state only if people had the courage and freedom to use reason publicly in all matters. The significance of Kant's analysis and prescriptions for modern Muslims is enormous. The present Ummah exists in a state of unparalleled immaturity. Not only has the capacity to think independently and freely nearly disappeared, it has become illegitimate. Attempts to institutionalize and democratize the spirit of ijtihad inspire fear among the masses and incite anger, resentment, and opposition from the ulama. The ulama, by generating discourses that have instilled a fear of reason and independent thought, have rendered the Islamic Ummah incapable of relying on its own judgment. The Ummah seems to know only one way: taqlid, imitation. On what is taqlid? The blind imitation of madhhab, often seen as an antithetical view to the ijtihadi view, see Ahmed, 42-47. The present Muslim world attempts to either ape the West or ape the past, a glorified and nebulous golden age. Sadly, we fail to realize that even to be good at imitation requires creativity and initiative. The condition of immaturity or jahiliyyah has become so widespread that the ulama, too, have become immature, have ceased to rely on their own rational faculties, and have surrendered the cardinal function of judgment/reasoning to the scholarship and religious judgment of a canonized and sacralized privileged elite from the 2nd and 3rd centuries of Islam. True religious scholarship has been reduced to memorization and recycling of medieval opinions and methodologies. New scholars are appreciated as long as they are seen as revivers of the past, and those who seek to reform or institute new practices are immediately viewed with suspicion. We remain a civilization that is petrified to think, following those who refuse to think. In the absence of new, invigorating thought, widespread immaturity prevails. From taqlid to ijtihad. The 20th century has proved to be more fortunate for the Ummah. More and more Muslims have mustered the courage to rely on their own reason and have sought to understand Islam and make it more relevant and meaningful to contemporary life. The impact of their ijtihad is unprecedented. Global movements for the revival of Islam have mushroomed, and the power and vitality of Islamic principles and ideas have galvanized Muslims everywhere. Nevertheless, the shadow of immaturity or jahiliyyah continues to dog even the most vibrant of Islamic movements. It is my fear that we may lose the momentum that independent thought spawned by thinkers like Sir Syed Ahmed Khan and Muhammad Abduh, Fazlur Rahman and Malik Benabi, Syed Nursi and Ali Bulak, Abdul Karim Souraj, Javed Ghamidi and Tariq Ramadan and many others have provided. This fear stems from my perception that independent thinking still remains spectacular but episodic, revolutionary but rare. We need independent thinking to become routine. The followers of some of these great thinkers have not emulated their leaders' spirit of ijtihad, and movements that have sprung from some of their ideas have once again institutionalized taqlid. In this discussion, I am clearly departing from the traditional Islamic understanding of the term jahiliyyah. I am referring to the refusal of Muslims in general to rely on their own judgment and reasoning as jahiliyyah. Taqlid without reflection is jahiliyyah, immaturity, and lack of enlightenment. I would like to point out how the concept of Jahiliyah itself has evolved. From the Quran, we can glean that Jahiliyah means the ignorance of the all-powerful, merciful, and omniscient God. Ignorance in the Quran is defined basically as ignorance of God, God's nature and attributes, and God's expectations of humanity. Subsequently, in the discourses of Islamic scholars, the term Jahiliyah slowly evolved to mean ignorance of Islamic principles and ignorance of what it takes to be a good Muslim. This understanding still dominates traditional discourses. Recent endeavors at ijtihad by the pioneers of contemporary Islamic revival have redefined Jahiliyah as absence of Islamic governance. This understanding of Jahiliyah is largely due to the political polemics of Maulana Maududi, from the Indian subcontinent, and Syed Qutb, Egypt. Unfortunately, their followers, too, remain in a state of Jahiliyah, for they have fallen into the habit of imitating their new demigods and sacrificed their own capacity, right, and duty to think. This is clearly evident in the immature and often violent manner in which they respond to any disagreement or criticism of these new masters. These reactions are very similar to the reactions of the traditional ulama and their followers to any attempt at approaching the Islamic heritage from a critical perspective. This is another manifestation that the Muslim Ummah exists in a state of self-imposed Jahiliyah. How does one escape this stifling and stultifying condition? How do we move from immaturity to enlightenment? How do we spark what Kant calls an age of enlightenment, a precursor to the enlightened society? An Islamic perspective of enlightenment. It is important that we first understand enlightenment and its Islamic nature. The Quran describes the human being as the best of creations, and this claim is premised on the human ability to reason. 95:4. We have indeed created man in the best of molds. Quran 95:4. The Quran does not invite blind followers, it demands and exhorts us to reflect and use our reason to read God's signs in nature, history, and text. 12:109. In all its presentations, the Quran presents evidence and proofs and, indeed, demands arguments and proofs from those who disbelieve its message. There is no suggestion or expectation in the Quran that the human being ceases to be the best of creations and becomes an ape, reversing evolution. The Quran does not ask believers to surrender their reasoning capacity, the very faculty on which it is relying for the cognition of God. It is reason, not ritual, which connects humanity with the divine, and this theme is the central essence of the Quran. Until the guardians of Islam and Muslims, their intellectuals and their ulama realize and emphasize this at every opportunity, the Muslim community will remain immature. Once a man came to Aisha, the wife of Prophet Muhammad, and asked her to describe to him the character of the late Prophet of Islam, Imam Muslim. Aisha's reply was at once succinct and deeply profound. She said, "Have you not read the Quran?" The Prophet's character was the embodiment of the Quran itself. This tradition is very well known and often invoked in the praise of the Prophet and to invite Muslims to imitate the Prophet. Unfortunately, very little substantive analysis of what Aisha meant is available in contemporary popular discourses. The tradition is used to inspire awe in the Prophet and to generate deep respect for his persona, but little else. There is rarely any effort made at advancing the meaning of this equation in terms of the Prophet's qualities and the Quran's character. The Quran, besides other things, is also the best tafsir, exegesis, of itself. The Quran describes itself, as the bearer of the truth and most importantly as Furqan. Blessed is he who hath revealed unto his slave the criterion, of right and wrong, that he may be a warner to the peoples. Quran 25.1. O ye who believe! If ye fear Allah, He will grant you a criterion, to judge between right and wrong, remove from you, all, evil, that may afflict, you, and forgive you, for Allah is the Lord of grace unbounded. Quran 8.29. Furqan means criterion for judgment or capacity to discern. It also means to differentiate between the right and wrong, and between justice and injustice. This understanding of the Quran implies that the Prophet's personality, which is the prototype for a Muslim, is the embodiment of the capacity to judge. If this is what Aisha meant, then it means that to be like the Prophet is to have furqan, which is to be capable of discernment. One of the enduring myths of Islamic beliefs is the extreme glorification of early Muslims. Muslim scholars, searching for authority, necessary in the absence of reason, to support their interpretations of Islam, created a hierarchy of interpretive privilege in Islam. The veracity of a particular opinion depends upon the personality and reputation of the person with whom it corresponds. The Prophet is on the top of the pyramid, followed by his companions, then come the companions of the companions, followed by the classical scholars. While the status of the Prophet is indubitable, the rest of the pyramid weighs upon the reason of subsequent generations of Muslims, to the point that today, even to disagree with a companion or with one of the classical scholars leads to calls for excommunication, takfir, and even endangers life itself. Islamic scholars have subtly propagated the myth that early Muslims are far superior in intellect and virtue than later Muslims, no matter what the issue is, and, therefore, contemporary understandings and interpretations must defer to past understandings and interpretations. Such a hierarchy cannot be derived from the Quran without prejudicial interpretation of Quranic phrases like "Are they equal, those who know and those who do not?" 39:9. This creative interpretation with selective references to the ahadith, traditions, has created a prison from which Muslim thinking finds it impossible to escape. The opinions of early jurists, which even for them were contingent on time and place, have today become the default for divine law. Human opinions are treated as if they were the very words of God, and often there is no differentiation between the opinions of, say, Imam al-Shafi, a prominent medieval jurist, and laws of Allah. To challenge the eminent jurist's opinions or even to subject them to a critical analysis is interpreted as an assault on Islam and Allah's divine Sharia. This has led to an incredibly tragic state of things, where to think is tantamount to not only launching an un-Islamic project but an anti-Islamic one. Thinking has been rendered illegitimate because it necessarily threatens the hegemony of past opinions. There are many traditions of the Prophet wherein he has praised Muslims who would come later. In one such remarkable tradition, the Prophet describes later Muslims as his brothers, who are even closer to him than his companions. Imam Muslim, CI 482. It is not really possible to definitively argue from the sources that the understanding of Islam of later Muslims will be inferior to that of early Muslims. However, Muslim eschatology argues that there will be general moral decay in society as we approach doomsday, but these arguments serve a debilitating purpose. Consider the paradox: if our objective is to revive Islamic society and emulate the moral excellence of early Muslims, then we must at least be their equals to replicate their efforts. Indeed, we have to be better than them, for they improved themselves with the help of the Prophet, and we have to do it without his direct personal guidance. The other alternative is to surrender to the inertia of history and let things be. Why bother to emulate those who are inimitable? If things are destined to get progressively worse as we approach doomsday, then why even raise the call for revival? It would be destined to fail. Indeed, the general lethargy in the global Muslim community suggests that such a tacit condition has already materialized. But when some Muslims look at other non-Muslim societies and remark, like Muhammad Abduh did upon visiting the West, that "I see Islam without Muslims," we realize that indeed for some people it is still possible to produce Islamic values in real life. The reality of this is extremely disturbing. First, we concede that perhaps humanity is degenerating and cannot aspire to equal those who lived centuries ago. And then we find that some people are able to emulate the past Islamic glory even without the explicit assistance of Islamic sources. These conditions simultaneously suggest that nothing is wrong with humanity itself, it is only Muslims who are declining. How, if at all, can Muslims as a community come out of this inertia of immaturity and inspire an age of enlightenment? I think that the route to this noble end is through a collective emergence from this self-imposed jahiliyyah. This task requires major changes in the outlook of Muslim intellectuals as well as Muslims in general. Our self-imposed immaturity does not stem from a complete disregard for reason, on the contrary, it stems from a lack of self-confidence. We need to encourage the use of reason, which we refuse to do so even when freedom is available to us. We also need confidence in our inherent capacity to understand, interpret, and apply Islam in our context. Our problem is not the lack of freedom to use reason, but the lack of freedom to use Islamic texts directly. We have to come out from the feeling of inferiority towards the Muslims of the past, take our destinies in our hands and chart our own straight path. Muslim intellectuals and scholars must stop acting as if they are defenders and guardians of Islam. This position inevitably leads to the conservativeness of thought. The responsibility of defending and safeguarding Islam is Allah's responsibility, and He has said so clearly. It is this fear that Islam will be diluted, misinterpreted, and distorted by contemporary Muslims who are inherently inferior that must be discarded. Muslims must stop performing God's task of safeguarding His message and start performing the human task of understanding and acting upon this message. Muslim scholars and intellectuals need to change the psyche of the masses by focusing attention not on what Islam is but on what Muslims do. The artifact of separating Islam from Muslims allows Muslims to have the best religion with the worst followers. The only way to escape this is to deconstruct the myth of the essential Islam and argue that Islam is what Muslims do and shift the burden of manifesting Islam onto human actions and away from sacred, unimplemented texts. We have to realize that Islamic civilization, in its totality, inclusive of its best and its worst, is also a tafsir, exegesis, of the Quran. Therefore, it is not enough to glorify ideas confined to text. They are meaningless until they are realized in this dunya, world. Conclusion. The Muslim community must be made to realize that our generations, the communities after the advent of Prophet Muhammad, the seal of prophets, are the best of all generations. Never has God ever trusted a people without a prophet. There are going to be no more new messengers or messages from the Almighty. We are for the first time on our own. We have the revelation, and so did past communities. But they all needed prophets to guide them. Even the great Sahaba, companions of Prophet Muhammad, lived life as pagans and in ignorance before Prophet Muhammad came to them as a guide and messenger. But the present Muslim Ummah is the only Ummah that Allah has trusted to act on its own. The only difference is that, unlike the messages of earlier prophets, Allah has promised to safeguard His revelations to Prophet Muhammad. We have to live up to God's expectations. And we cannot do that until we become capable of acting on our own judgment, until we are strong and courageous enough to understand and apply His message in our times. Maturity and enlightenment at one level means simply living in our times. We must escape the prisons of past authorities and past achievements and focus on our task at hand. Very simply, we must grow up and take responsibility. Be enlightened and act mature. To achieve this noble end, we need to encourage in every possible manner the confidence that we are capable of understanding and realizing the maqasid, purpose, of Islam and foster a culture of tolerance for those who have the courage to think. Any grandiose project towards the development of democracy and pluralism, or towards the respect of freedom to believe and freedom to chart one's own destiny will not gain any foothold in the Islamic world until the condition of self-imposed immaturity is alleviated. Until individual Muslims and their intellectuals and scholars can dare to pass judgment on the present, and view their heritage from a critical perspective without allowing the past to prejudice them, until then freedom of thought and action, a constitutive element of Islamic society, will remain beyond our grasp. World Interfaith Harmony Week. HRH Prince Ghazi bin Muhammad delivers. HM King Abdullah II's proposal at UN. Bismillah al-Rahman al-Rahim. Mr. President, I have the honor to introduce, on behalf of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan and the 29 other CO sponsors, Albania, Azerbaijan, Bahrain, Bangladesh, Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, Egypt, El Salvador, Georgia, Guatemala, Guyana, Honduras, Kazakhstan, Kuwait, Liberia, Libya, Mauritius, Morocco, Oman, Paraguay, Qatar, the Russian Federation, Saudi Arabia, Tanzania, Tunisia, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, Uruguay and Yemen. The draft resolution A/65/L5 entitled the World Interfaith Harmony Week. Allow me to explain in brief the reasoning behind this resolution, which was launched by H.M. King Abdullah II bin al-Hussein before the United Nations General Assembly on September 23, 2010. As this august assembly is well aware, our world is rife with religious tension and, sadly, mistrust, dislike and hatred. These religious tensions can easily erupt into communal violence. They also facilitate the demonizing of the other, which in turn predisposes public opinion to support war against peoples of other religions. Thus, for example, according to the results of the 2008 Gallup poll, one of the largest international religious surveys in history, 53% of Westerners have unfavorable or very unfavorable opinions of Muslims, and 30% of Muslims polled worldwide hold negative views of Christians. The misuse or abuse of religions can thus be a cause of world strife, whereas religions should be a great foundation for facilitating world peace. The remedy for this problem can only come from the world's religions themselves. Religions must be part of the solution, not part of the problem. Much good work has already been done towards this, starting really with the Second Vatican Council from 1962 to 1965 by hundreds of intrafaith and interfaith groups all over the world and of all religions. Yet the forces inciting inter-religious tensions, notable among them being religious fundamentalisms of various kinds, are better organized, more experienced, better coordinated, more motivated and more ruthless. They have more stratagems, more institutes, more money, more power and garner more publicity, such that they by far outweigh all the positive work done by the various interfaith initiatives. The sad proof of this is that religious tensions are on the rise, not on the decline. Mr. President, turning now to the text itself, allow me to explain some of its most essential terminology and concepts. 1. In the very title of the resolution and in the second operative paragraph and elsewhere, the word harmony is used in the Chinese sense of the term. We add it to the term tolerance, which we have also used, because tolerance can suggest that the other is so negative they have to be tolerated. We cannot use acceptance because it implies that religions accept each other's doctrines rather than their right to those doctrines, and this is not the case. We cannot use the term peace alone because it suggests merely the absence of war, and not necessarily the absence of hatred. Only the Confucian concept of harmony can rescue us here, because it suggests not merely peace, but also beautiful and dynamic interaction between different elements within a whole. 2. In the third operative paragraph, there is mention of love of God and love of the neighbor, or love of the good and love of the neighbor. Why is this religious reference necessary in a UN resolution? In answer to this question, it will be noted first that this draft resolution is unique because it is specifically about peace between religions and not about anything else, therefore some religious references in this particular case is only natural. To rigidly maintain the contrary would be to disregard the feelings of 85% of the world's population which belongs to one or another faith. Second, and more importantly perhaps, we include these references because whilst we all agree that it is clearly not the business of the UN to engage in theology, it is nevertheless the primary goal of the UN to make and safeguard peace, and without the specific mention of God and of the two commandments of love, see Matthew 22:34-40 and Mark 12:28-31, many if not most devout Muslims, Christians, and Jews will consider a secular call for an interfaith harmony weak a feckless platitude that they cannot fully or sincerely support. For in the Holy Bible Jesus Christ, echoing the words of Deuteronomy, said, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word of God." Luke 4:4 and Matthew 4:4, see also, Deuteronomy 8:2-3, and also that, "Hallowed be thy name." Matthew 6:9, and similar meanings are to be found in the Holy Quran, wherein it is stated that no act is rewarded save for seeking the countenance of the Lord, the Most High. Al-Layl 92:19-20, and that, verily the remembrance of God is of all things the greatest. From Al-Ankabut 29:45. In other words, for many Muslims, Christians, and Jews, who together make up perhaps 55% of the world's population and, I regret to say, are involved in most of the world's conflicts, it is necessary to mention the substance of their faiths. Otherwise, hoping to foster peace between religions by foisting upon them an external and purely secular and bureaucratic language, is simply a house divided against itself which shall not stand. Matthew 12:25. Third, it will be noted that this language excludes no one, of any religion or of no faith at all. Every person of goodwill, with or without faith, can and should commit to love of the neighbor and love of God, or love of the neighbor and love of the good. Loving the neighbor and the good is after all the essence of goodwill. And referring to the good obviously does not necessarily imply belief in God or in a particular religion, even though for many believers the good is God precisely. Jesus Christ said, "No one is good but God alone." Mark 10:18, Luke 18:19, and Matthew 19:17, and the good, Al-Bar, is one of God's names in the Holy Quran Al-Tur 52:28. Thus, speaking of the good is a theologically correct but inclusive formula in so far as it goes that unites all humanity and leaves out no one. Fourth, there is another reason why it is specifically necessary to mention love of the neighbor. It sets an invaluable practical standard based upon which people can ask themselves and each other if their actions stem from love towards the neighbor or not. Indeed, as the Prophet Muhammad said, "None of you has faith in God until you love for your neighbor what you love for yourself." Sahih Muslim, Kitab al-Iman, Volume p.67, Hadith number 45. 3. Also in the third operative paragraph, the phrase "on a voluntary basis" is used because the entire proposal must be purely voluntary. No place of worship should be forced to observe the World Interfaith Harmony Week, for whilst we hope to encourage interfaith harmony, the last thing we want is for anyone at all to feel that anything is being imposed on his or her faith, beliefs, or convictions. Nevertheless, one can conceive of positive incentives to encourage and help support and monitor the implementation of this resolution. 4. Finally, also in the third operative paragraph, the phrase "each according to their own religious traditions or convictions" is vital because the different religions do not necessarily interpret love of God and the neighbor in exactly the same way, and do not all want it said that they do. This phrase thus avoids the dangers of syncretism or reductionism and allows for religious differences within the same goal of working towards inter-religious peace and harmony. In summary, then, I very humbly ask the member states of the United Nations General Assembly to adopt the proposed draft resolution for the World Interfaith Harmony Week, noting that it excludes no individual, compromises no one, commits no one, forces no one, harms no one, costs nothing, and on the contrary, includes everyone, celebrates everyone, benefits everyone, unites everyone, and has the potential to bring much needed peace and harmony to the entire world, inshallah. Thank you, Mr. President. Ahmadiyya Anjuman Isha-at Islam, Lahore, UK. Founders of the first Islamic mission in the UK, established 1913 as the Woking Muslim Mission. Dar es Salaam, 15 Stanley Avenue, Wembley, UK, HA04JQ. Center, 020-8903-2689. President, 01793740670. Secretary, 07737240777. Treasurer, 01932348283. Email, info@aaiil.uk. Websites, www.aaiil.org/uk, www.ahmadiyya.org, www.virtualmosque.co.uk. Donations, https://www.kfonline.org/charity profile/aayuluk. Draft Resolution A/65/L565th Session World Interfaith Harmony Week. The General Assembly, recalling its resolutions 53/243 of October 6, 1999 on the Declaration and Program of Action relating to a Culture of Peace, 57/6 of November 2002 concerning the promotion of a culture of peace and nonviolence, 58/128 of December 19, 2003 on the promotion of religious and cultural understanding, harmony and cooperation, 64/164 of December 18, 2009 on the elimination of all forms of intolerance and discrimination based on religion or belief, 64 81st of December 7, 2009 on the promotion of interreligious and intercultural dialogue, understanding, and cooperation for peace, and 64 14th of November 10, 2009 on the alliance of civilizations, recognizing the imperative need for dialogue among different faiths and religions in enhancing mutual understanding, harmony, and cooperation among people, recalling with appreciation various global, regional and sub-regional initiatives on mutual understanding and interfaith harmony including, inter alia, the Tripartite Forum for Interfaith Cooperation for Peace, and the A Common Word, recognizing that the moral imperatives of all religions, convictions, and beliefs call for peace, tolerance, and mutual understanding. 1. Reaffirms that mutual understanding and interreligious dialogue constitute important dimensions of a culture of peace. 2. Proclaims the first week of February of every year the World Interfaith Harmony Week between all religions, faiths and beliefs. 3. Encourages all states to support, on a voluntary basis, the spread of the message of interfaith harmony and goodwill in the world's churches, mosques, synagogues, temples, and other places of worship during that week based on love of God and love of the neighbor, or based on love of the good and love of the neighbor, each according to their own religious traditions or convictions. 4. Requests the Secretary General to keep the General Assembly informed of the implementation of the present resolution.